I'll begin the first part of the program by introducing the moderator of our first panel. That's Professor Jeff Brantingham. He's an archaeologist who focuses on human behavior in complex environments, including how criminals move around in cities and select their targets. He currently is collaborating with mathematicians, social scientists, and law enforcement agencies in order to develop effective methods of preventing crime. He will introduce the rest of the panel. So I give you our first panel.
Thank you, Nancy, and welcome everybody. Thank you for attending this very important event. We're happy to be able to celebrate this with you. And my name, as Nancy says, is Jeff Brantingham. I'm going to be moderating what I'm hoping is going to be a bit more of a conversation than a discussion per se. We're going to talk about crime, aggression, urban anthropology, issues of the communities in which crime is endemic in this city and relevant abroad as well. And these are all issues that are absolutely critical for thinking about the growth of Los Angeles over the coming decades. So I am joined here on this panel, make sure the microphone is working properly. I'm joined here on the right here by Professor Dan Fessler. He is a professor of anthropology in the department at UCLA. And he's also the director of the Center for Behavior, Evolution, and Culture at UCLA, which is a very vibrant discussion group and a place where scholars from around the globe come to present on their research. And he's worked extensively in Indonesia and recently among the many things that he's doing, he's engaged in a very extensive program of experimental work here on campus with a variety of different populations. And I guess a good way of thinking about your work is to think about how contemporary human behavior is positioned within sort of an evolutionary context. So welcome to Dan Fessler. And then I'm also very honored to have Professor Jorja Leap here, who's sitting further to the right. Jorja is a professor here at UCLA in social welfare. She did receive her PhD from UCLA Anthropology and has been a professor in social welfare since the early 90s. And she's really gone to show how it is that anthropology can be used in the field. She is an expert on issues of violence prevention, crisis intervention, trauma response, and you've done work both internationally and particularly here within Los Angeles among street gangs. And you've also participated in many committees and initiatives sponsored not only by the city of Los Angeles, but recently something under Barack Obama, isn't that correct? So hopefully we'll hear something about that. I will also talk about some of my own research, which is focused on using things, I'm sure many of you have heard the term big data, using the droves and droves of data that are collected by law enforcement to help police improve the way in which they police their environments. And so you'll hear a little bit about that and how it fits in with anthropology overall. So what I'm going to do is spend probably the first 30 minutes or so prompting my colleagues with some questions so that we can get a conversation going. And then in the remaining 20 minutes of this panel, I'm going to open it up to you. Hopefully we can have a microphone that comes around and give you the opportunity to ask some questions, probe some of the topics that we've been talking about. And then afterwards in the reception, hopefully we can follow up with any additional questions that you might have. So where I thought I would start this presentation originally is just to note that crime in Los Angeles right now is at historical lows. We have not seen crime in Los Angeles at these levels since the late 1950s, which is a tremendous sort of realization from the peaks of crime in the early 1990s in Los Angeles in particular. We've come down a dramatic amount, more than 50% reduction in crime over the ensuing 20 years or so. And having said that, there's still a lot of crime out there. I mean, in a given year within the city of Los Angeles alone, we have 15 to 20,000 cars are stolen. We still have 300 plus homicides or so every year within the city of Los Angeles. That's not taking into account the larger metropolitan region. So crime is still a big problem, even though we're at historical lows. Now, I myself work on sort of not out on the streets, but Jorja, you have worked extensively on the front lines, so to speak, and I was hoping maybe you could give us a little bit of perspective of what it's like to be an anthropologist working out on the front lines where crime is very salient.
It's really sort of an extraordinary experience because when I do introduce myself as an anthropologist, people always say, aren't you supposed to be in Africa studying? It's sort of not put in an urban context. And then when I start to talk about what I do, people immediately nod and say, why aren't there more of you on the street in a strange sort of a way? Jeff's exactly right. I have been on the street among gang members for the better part of a decade to understand their lives, and this just happened to correspond to the time that the crime dip began. And what my work looked at and continues to look at is what happens to the group of people who are the core of individuals committing crime over and over and over again. Why do they do it? How do they make sense of their lives? And what are they really like when we drill down into their existences beneath criminality? And it has been an enlightening experience and also part of the juxtaposition of really classical anthropology as I was trained in this extraordinary department and how it meets real life policy and practice challenges in the world. And so that kind of nexus between academic rigorous research and policy and practice has been a revelation for me and a demonstration of just how important anthropology is.
So as an ethnographer, I mean, how do you actually sit down and build those relationships with people and talk to them? And what's sort of your day-to-day practice when you get down to it?
Well, I'll be very blunt with you. You don't show up and say, hi, I'm an anthropologist. I'm here excited to see you. These are people that regularly pack sub-automatic weapons, and some of them, quite candidly, have killed folks. So what was interesting to me in a very classic way is that I needed to have people that would be my navigators throughout the community. And what I did was to identify gang leaders and former gang leaders and enlist their trust and build relationships with them first. The other thing is I had a leg up because I had worked as a social worker in the community. Maybe I can show a couple of the slides very quickly. The major scene of crime in the city of Los Angeles has been the housing developments or the projects of South Los Angeles. This is one in particular in Jordan Downs, and I think if we just quickly, I want to sort of give you a sense of place. I'll come back to this one. The next one, next slide. This will sort of show you, and it's not a particularly inviting environment, to say the least. But what was critical to my work was, as I said, getting to know and enlisting the trust of gang leaders and former gang leaders. I will be very transparent. I had a hidden disability that I should disclose. In the midst of my career, I did what seemed to be a preposterous thing, which was I fell in love with exactly the wrong person that an urban ethnographer who worked with street gangs could do. I fell in love and subsequently married a member of the Los Angeles Police Department. So you could only imagine my reception in urban communities. And what did in fact happen and was quite challenging was gang members would plant stories with me to see if I could be trusted or if I would take them back to my husband. And when they discovered that I would not take them back, the other thing is they would start to tell me about crimes they had committed, and we worked out a code where I would say to them, why don't you tell me about a friend that something like this happened to? And we sort of maintained what the Jews would call a legal fiction, so to speak, about what they were telling me. But this was the community, and this was the type of community that I operated in, and it has become critical for me to literally live within that community and be recognized within that community before I could begin to ask a question about what was going on with criminality, with life, with personal history.
That's amazing. So, about how long did that process of building up that sense of community take for you?
It's still going on.
It's still going on.
It's still going on, and it is also It's part of our challenge as anthropologists and researchers that we can not only be convincing, but that we can also tell these communities that we are going to use their research to enable them to build the strength and efficacy of their community. So to really answer your question, I would say it took a good 18 months, a year and a half to convince them they could trust me. And the other thing is, these were very smart people. They did not want to be exploited for data. And what they would say is, what are you going to do for us? What are you going to give to us? Because they had already had the experience of researchers, not anthropologists, but demographers, other folk, going in, mining for data, and not delivering anything to the community. So it took me quite a while.
If I could just interject there, I think if you stop the average American on the street and ask them about the relationship between intelligence and socioeconomic status, they would tell you, well, rich people are smarter than poor people. Now, on tests, that objectively is true. In part, that's a function of the opportunities for education and nutritional adequacy and so on. But the stereotype that poor folks are stupid really completely underestimates the challenges of being poor in a society that has very unequal distribution of wealth like our own. So when Jorja says these are very sophisticated, smart people who happen to be poor and live in a high crime environment, that's typical. It is easy to live in a gated community in the sense that you don't actually have to solve very many problems in order to survive. These people have to solve problems every day, and hence they're savvy in negotiating with Jorja as an interloper in their area.
And I'm so grateful to you for pointing that out, because I will also tell you, the gang leaders get there with the same combination of skills and knowledge that the head of a major corporation does. In fact, I would tell you, I can close my eyes and think I'm listening to an MBA rather than a shot caller. It's very much the case.
That's right. So Dan, you bring up a sort of interesting perspective on individuals and how it is that we perceive their sort of abilities given the context that we're in. You come at the problems of, let's say, aggression and other things that may be relevant from understanding crime in a very sort of a different framework, if you will, than an ethnographer would. So maybe you might give us a little a view of how it is that you approach these problems.
Sure, maybe we can see that triptych again that we had up there. So a little audience participation here. If you guys take a look at this, so on the left side we have a heat map of crime that Jeff's going to talk about in a moment. In the center, a painting that's depicting a member of a criminal gang, one of Jorja's participants or informants, and on the right, one of their typical weapons. If you look either at the center picture or even simpler, look at the right, think for yourself, and I won't ask you to, in the interest of time, we won't actually poll you for data, but ask yourself, in feet and inches, how tall do you think the individual holding that gun is? Okay. And just go with your gut reaction. Now remember that number, okay? If you think about it, right, there's sort of two logical possibilities, okay? One is just on the basis of not knowing anything except the individual has a gun, right? And one is you might think, well, larger individuals are prone to be more aggressive than smaller individuals, so I'm going to guess that that person's big. And the other is what you might call the Samuel Colt equation, right, which is that God made man and Colt made them equal, as they say in the cowboy movies, right? That is that small individuals might be more prone to carry a gun to compensate for their lesser physical formidability. Well, we've actually polled American gun owners, that is, those that respond to our polls, and criminal individuals potentially don't. But we know empirically that there is no difference in height between people who own guns in the United States and people who don't. There's a difference in girth, but that has more to do with where in the country gun ownership is popular and the problems of obesity that happen to geographically co-occur. Okay? And yet, when we know from experiments that we performed that when we ask people to estimate the size of an individual holding a gun compared to another gun-like object that isn't a weapon, they think that that individual is larger. Okay? And that's interesting. So in her introductory remarks, Nancy mentioned a theoretical perspective that didn't exist when our department was founded, and that's evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is a theoretical frame which attempts to understand contemporary human behavior in light of the evolution of our species. and in particular, which argues that many aspects of our minds, species-typical aspects of our minds, are discrete adaptations, that is, mechanisms that evolved in order to solve problems that our ancestors confronted. Well, figuring out who is likely to win a fight and what you should do in a potentially violent situation is an evolutionarily very old problem. It's a problem that predates our species. In fact, it's a problem that predates mammals. Okay? So any social animal will encounter a member of its species and need to figure out if there's a conflict, who's going to win this. Now, in simple animals, say lizards, for example, the lizards that you see out there on the fence, they're not doing push-ups because it's Southern California. That's a threat display. What they're doing is they're displaying their physical capabilities. And the lizards have the ability to assess who is larger and stronger. So my postdoctoral fellow and many graduate students and even more undergraduates and I reasoned that all social animals must have the ability to cognitively represent relative size and strength, because those are going to be the determinants of whether you should fight or flee or try and negotiate in a situation of conflict. Now, it's often said that natural selection isn't an engineer, it's a tinkerer. And by that we mean that new traits evolve from old traits. As behavior changes, old systems get modified for new purposes. So obviously, in a species with a very complex behavioral repertoire like our own, the things that go into who is likely to win a fight involve things like access to technology, training, the size of the alliance, and so on. But the system, the cognitive system that represents that simple equation, who's likely to win, is the same one that's operating in the lizard, namely that it uses the dimensions of size and strength. So we know from now about 40 total experiments that information that you have about a potential assailant or about yourself changes your envisioned size of the assailant. Okay? We ran an experiment within 24 hours after President Obama announced the killing by SEAL Team 6 of Osama bin Laden, and we asked Americans what they thought the average height of an al-Qaeda member was. He shrank when Osama bin Laden was killed, okay? Because the organization had been decapitated. So the fighting strength of the organization had been reduced. Maybe we can just go to the next slide, Jeff. Yeah, so the kinds of measures that we use and that Jeff and I currently and Jorja have a grant proposal in where we're very excited about the possibility of deploying these measures on the streets of Los Angeles with gang members. We present people with things like those two arrays you see in the middle. And we describe information about a target individual to a participant, and we ask them, how big do you think this person is? Okay? Now, we're not asking them accurate perceptual questions. If they can see the person, they answer exactly as you would expect them to. Instead, what we're tapping into is the evolved psychological mechanism whereby they cognitively represent the relative fighting ability of the individuals. Now, on the top there, you see two members of violent criminal organizations. Folks in the back probably can't see the individual on the left very clearly. The fellow on the right is a member of a gang here in Southern California, and he has his gang identity tattooed on his forehead. It says Compton across his upper lip. The fellow on the left, as you can tell, he's currently incarcerated. He's a member of a violent neo-Nazi organization. It says skinhead across his forehead. He's got a swastika between his eyebrows. Now, the interesting thing is that these two individuals, if they had the opportunity to, would try and kill each other. Okay? That is, they're members of violent organizations that are opposed to one another's existence. But they're, as you see in the photograph, they're using the same technology. That is, they're using facial tattooing as a signal of group identity. This is not an accident that many, many violent organizations have a prestige hierarchy within which the more visible the tattoo, the greater the praise that is reaped on that is reaped by the individual. So having a tattoo on your chest doesn't count as much as having a tattoo on your neck, doesn't count as much as having a tattoo on your forehead. Why is that? The answer is because those are objective commitment devices. You can't say, oh, no, I'm not with those guys, if you've got a permanent marker on your forehead that says, I'm one of those guys. Okay? So by virtue of that, the individual is committed to conflict if they encounter a member of a rival group. Now, you might be saying, look, UCLA, this is a great institution, and happily, it's in a very safe environment, and you all, as prosperous alumni who've benefited from your educations here, live in very safe communities. All these discussions about crime are rather obtuse, right? The important point here is that you have the same psychology as every other human being. So on the bottom there, you see photoshopped the same individual ostensibly with face paint at an athletic competition with our rival institution there, USC, right? We ran an experiment here at UCLA in which participants saw either the face on the left or the face on the right, and they saw these arrays that you see up here in the middle, and they were asked to pick out what they thought the size and muscularity of the individual was. They only saw one of those two faces. And the people who saw the painted face thought that that individual was larger than the people who saw the unpainted face. The reason is because they're recognizing that that individual is objectively committed to conflict should conflict break out. If you show up at a UCLA-USC game with paint on your face that says, I'm a fan of one team, you can't back down if, I think that the scientific term is when the feces hits the rotating blades, right? And it is the same recognition that leads to that technology in rival violent groups. They're simply following exactly the same logic. So even if you live in a safe community, you are constantly making these calculations about the potential formidability of an opponent. And that influences all kinds of things, including voting behavior. Think about what happened after 9/11 in terms of the way that the country swung to the right, started ostracizing individuals who could potentially be construed as outgroups, started demonizing people, and so on.
This is so critical because another group that I've studied has been individuals who choose to leave gang life and denounce their gang ties. And the single most important ritual that they go through is tattoo removal. And it is lengthy. These two gentlemen, by the way, and I interviewed men and women in the process of having facial tattoos removed, and I've watched the process. It is a lengthy process. There is a real commitment, and it is a message to gang members they are no longer involved. So this really cuts both ways in terms of people also communicating, I am changing my identity, I'm going to change my life narrative, but there's also been tattoo removal sites that have been attacked, been graffitied, and they're also seen as very threatening to gang members and gang mechanisms.
Let me just be clear here and say these sorts of mechanisms, and Jorja, you probably have experience with this on the street, are these mechanisms meant to guarantee success in a conflict, or are they meant to avert the conflict upon encounter?
So in one, that is, threats are designed to intimidate rivals. So any social animal will have a threat display because both parties are actually better off if they agree about who would win the fight and therefore don't have to win the fight. The fight happens when there's a symmetry of the threats. When the two cats both arch their backs and neither one backs down, then they go after each other. Okay? So these signals are intended to be threatening with regard to the opponent, but they have value within the group, and I'm sure Jorja can elaborate on the local ethnographic particulars here in Los Angeles. They have value within the group because knowing that an individual is objectively committed, right, that they cannot easily back out, means that they're a more reliable ally if a conflict occurs. Sure.
And there's a whole series of behaviors. I say this half jokingly. I observed sort of gang charm school, where gang members were taught how to walk, how to look intimidating with their walk, how to carry their weapons so it would be half concealed but half obvious, what tattoos to get. And the tattoo was seen as a sign not only of intimidation but of commitment. And as you rose through the ranks in the gang, you were expected to acquire certain tattoos. They're also extremely useful, not just in the community as signals to all of us as community members, but in prison. Because there, the tattoos often mean a real sign of intimidation and the difference between life and death. So it's both signaling intimidation, showing identity, and also knowing where you line up either in community life or inside prison walls.
So one question is, it's my impression of the last 20 years that the number of individuals carrying guns on the street of Los Angeles is way down. There's you don't think so?
Absolutely not.
No, okay.
No, absolutely not.
Okay, so I was going to ask, thanks Jorja, that whether, if people are sort of trade-off carrying guns, does that mean things like tattooing and stuff will go up as a sort of a counterbalance to sort of that grand equalizer, if you will?
I would say we can expect that in the abstract if the guns are a signal. But it all depends on how much the guns are a signal. And just because we've been talking about guns so much, I think it's important to foreground another important contribution of evolutionary anthropology in this area, and that's the relationship between gun ownership and violence in society. So this is a case where the data changed my mind entirely. Owning a gun does put you at risk of violence, primarily in the form of suicide, and to a lesser extent, domestic violence. But gun ownership at the population level is not predictive of homicide rates at all. So Canada has the same per capita gun ownership as the United States does, but it has a much lower rate of violent crime. The thing that is predictive is income inequality. Okay? That is, Canada has a much more flat redistribution system wherein the difference between the haves and the have-nots is much less. And when Jorja says these gang leaders are, smart CEOs, these are people who are making the best of a bad situation in many ways. When the difference between the people at the bottom and the people at the top is huge, it is worth taking enormous risks, including the risks of death or incarceration, in order to try and improve what you have. When you reduce that difference, you reduce the incentives for risk-taking in general and violence in particular.
So Jorja, you've been in some pretty dangerous situations, I imagine. I've read your book and am surprised at some of the situations in which you find yourself in. Have you been interested in getting a tattoo to show your affiliation? And
what would your husband think?
Yeah, that's right. No, but so how do you protect yourself under those circumstances? I mean, these are not necessarily safe environments in which you're working.
In fact, I want to go back to what was the middle slide, because this is a particularly evocative for me. This is a group, and you'll see me, that I am a smiling white woman in the middle of the photo. And this is a group that I just is peopled by some individuals who were or who are very close to some very dangerous folk. And this is a group of gentlemen who were gang members, who have been in prison. One of them was on San Quentin on death row for 23 years. These are very hardened criminals. They're part of a group in Watts that is trying to learn how to be effective fathers to their children. And I can tell you, I've been with this group and with some of its individual members at some very frightening moments. When Christopher Dorner, the LAPD officer who sort of went rogue and killed several people, I was with these men while that was going on, and they referred to him as a hero. And they said they wished that he had killed more people. And they knew my husband had been LAPD. He was retired at that point. And there was a moment where I thought, these men are enraged. I've also been with gang members when they started to talk about drug deals, committing crimes, when they had weapons. And that's why I had such a strong reaction, because we've also got to remember the weapons that they are carrying are not legally being carried. None are registered. They are part of the black market in weaponry. It may have been foolish on my part, but I genuinely believe that gang members are smart enough that they did not want to see the Los Angeles Times headline, "White woman, wife of cop, shot and killed in South LA." They do not want things happening there to bring the attention of the police. They want to ply their business unimpeded. So for that very rational reason, I never felt danger. For another very irrational reason, I never felt danger because of sort of the look on my face there says it all. And this is a very organized portrait, of course. They're kind of my family. And I became part of them, and they became part of me. And the other thing is they've got excellent crap detectors. The LAPD and the sheriff's office would put undercover agents, and they would know within a week's time who was undercover and who was not supposed to be there. So for a combination of the rational and the irrational, I felt safe. However, I would say the most significant part of this was they did not want public attention. And it was evolutionary. They knew what it meant. They knew it meant prison. They knew it meant jail. They knew it meant disruption in their families, and they did not want to undergo that any longer.
think actually that gives us a nice opportunity for you, Jeff, to discuss some of your work, because the question of geographical distribution of activities and resource opportunities versus threats, this is exactly what you've worked on. So maybe you can share with our friends here some of the things that you've been doing with the LAPD.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The three of us all work on issues that are closely related to crime, but at very different scales and with different types of data. So whereas Jorja works ethnographically with the populations, and Dan works experimentally on issues trying to figure out how do the psychological mechanisms work in a way that promotes or prevents aggression, I actually work on the data side of things. So looking at the large-scale patterns that emerge out of crime. And Los Angeles Police Department, every police department around the nation actually collects tremendous amount of data on where and when events are occurring, and actually a lot of contextual data about those events themselves. And the picture is incredibly complicated. We generally have this impression that crime is, there's the bad side of town and there's the good side of town, and crime only ever occurs on the bad side of town, never occurs on the good side of town. That's where all the criminals reside. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Yes, there are some neighborhoods in Los Angeles that have much more crime than other neighborhoods, but crime is actually everywhere. It's in all environments, and here you're looking at a large swath of the San Fernando Valley. The reservoir is right in the middle there, and Ventura is running along the bottom of the slide. This is a very large area covering many different types of communities, and you'll see in the case of residential burglary, it's occurring all over the place. And it's often very random in the way that it appears. The challenge that I sort of set out a number of years ago with some collaborators in mathematics was really to say, can we understand why crime hotspots are doing what they're doing? Can we figure out in a very rigorous way why a hotspot appears, why it spreads, and why it disappears? And if you can do that, then you can turn around and say to the police, listen, we understand how the crime pattern is evolving, and if you use that information, you can actually get out ahead of the crime and do something to prevent it. So, I'm a strong believer in the idea that prevention is much better than waiting for the crime to happen, trying to find out who did it, and then incarcerating them. We know the limits of incarceration. I mean, we've long surpassed the limits of incarceration. So much so that the Supreme Court has mandated a reduction in prison population sizes in California. We need to do different things to be able to try and get out in front of crime. And that's a lot of what the research I've been focusing on here at UCLA is all about. But I'd say that it's as important to do this in a sort of a rigorous mathematical way or work with mathematicians, but it's also important to think about it in the context of what's actually driving the behavior, what's driving the crime. And here again, I would say I have a slightly different perspective. It's not ethnographic. It's more thinking about what are the commonalities that describe all burglars, regardless of whether you're looking at them in Los Angeles or Chicago or London or Tel Aviv or wherever it happens to be. What are the commonalities? And you'd be surprised at how similar criminals are, regardless of where you're actually looking. So a great example of this is something called journey to crime. So journey to crime is a term that's used to describe what's the distance between where an offender lives and where they commit their crime. Now, the impression is, if you live in Culver City, where I live, or the Palisades, or wherever it happens to be, that if your house is broken into, that somebody from way across town, that doesn't look like you, sound like you, act like you, drove all the way across town to break into your house. The opposite is true. When you look at the journey to crime characteristics of populations, most offenders commit their crimes in the immediate vicinity of where they live, where they work, or where they play, right? In fact, if your house is broken into, I would look for the nearest teenager. Really, it is not somebody who doesn't look like you or act like you or dress like you. It is somebody who has all of those characteristics. They fit in. They know what the risks of their local environment are. If I were to drive down to South LA, I would not know what the risks are. I wouldn't know where the good targets are. It's the people who live in those areas who understand the ebb and flow of population. They understand when a house is empty and when it's not empty, and they use that to their advantage. The one thing I've learned overall is that offenders like their low-hanging fruit. They like to do what's easy most of the time. And because this is common no matter where you look, and in fact it's common when you look at violent crime. People who like bar fights like to go to the same bars that they always go to because that's where they know they're going to get overserved and where they're going to find people who want to get into fights. They don't go to some bar where they don't really know people. They go to the places where it's going to work for them, and the same thing for burglars. Knowing that, you can actually develop models that will work wherever you go. So you can develop models that help police put their resources in the right place to get out ahead of a hotspot, and it works in Los Angeles, or it works in Chicago, or it works in London, or wherever you may be. And that's part of what I've been doing over the past couple of years, is developing those technologies.
So are police agencies actually employing this technique to pre-deploy their resources?
That's right, they are. So in Los Angeles Police Department has been doing what you call predictive policing for the past 2.5 years, using it in a variety of communities, using technologies, the research for which was developed here at UCLA, to actually help predict where crime is going to occur today, and then put their people in those locations on a day-to-day basis to help prevent crime. And this is actually a photograph from a location in the San Fernando Valley where you have a little box. It's a 500 by 500 square foot box that basically says, this is where the risk of crime today is highest. And we know statistically that this is the case. You know, all the experiments have been done to demonstrate that. LAPD uses this information to do things like what you see in this slide. This was one of their what they call community policing sergeants. He's responsible for driving the community policing effort of this division. He said, you know what, boss? We're going to go out into that box and we're going to knock on all the doors in that housing complex, and we're going to get everybody to come out and have a community meeting for 15, 20 minutes. Right? Community policing on the fly. And just getting people together and saying, listen, we've got a problem with car theft or with burglary from motor vehicle or with burglary, and saying, listen, protect your stuff, lock it up. Or oftentimes in a setting like this, you'll have a person who's standing there pointing over here saying, that's the guy you should be looking for right there. Many times the community members, in not every setting, but many times community members want to communicate to the police. But they often don't know how to have an opportunity to do that. They're often afraid of that.
Snitch factor.
The snitch factor. That's absolutely right. So one thing, and then I'll maybe ask some other questions here, is it's often not recognized that 80 or 90% of the crime that police respond to comes from public reporting. The number of crimes that police actually discover on their own is very, very small. Policing is really a public-police partnership. It doesn't work without without public partnership. You really are dependent upon the public to report those events for them to be able to respond to it. And doing anything to help build up those relationships, even when they're incredibly fraught, I think is important, and that's probably your experience.
Yeah, and I think that's my experience. The other part of it is you mentioned prevention, and this is also evolutionary psychology in an interesting way. Most gang members that I have known, both black and brown, do not want their children in the business. They want their children to be in another type of environment. That's why, for example, working with the fathers as I do, this goes back to the point you made about prevention. And this is where, say, the work that Jeff is doing and what we're looking at, the mayor's office and other human services entities have come in and put prevention programs into these hot spots as well. Not only the current crime can be dealt with, but that those future generations can be put down a different pathway, along with also, we are in the beginning phases of trying to build up schools and education. So it's a multi-level problem, and looking at the hotspots, looking at crime, looking at cognitive development and how things happen over time evolutionarily, all comes together, I think, in all of our efforts.
Yeah, if I could just add a footnote to that, as you probably know, in the media there have been accusations of a liberal bias in the academy, and social scientists in particular are often accused of having a liberal political agenda. On topics like these, it should be quite clear that the rational decision for society is unified regardless of how you feel about a variety of social issues. So if you're a fiscal conservative, you should be really in favor of prevention rather than punishment. It costs $50,000 a year for the state of California to incarcerate somebody, and that's not in a maximum security facility, that's just the average cost. Okay? If you compare that with the cost of, say, a Head Start program, which is a few $1,000s per year, and then you look at the additive cost over, say, 10 years of that Head Start program, for the cost of 1 year of incarceration, you can substantially reduce, that is, say, $50,000 spread out over 10 years at $5,000 a year, you can substantially reduce the likelihood that that individual will ever be incarcerated. This is a good deal. So if you are a political conservative, and we won't bring social issues outside of the issue of the distribution of resources within society into it, if you're a political conservative and part of your political conservatism is fiscal conservatism, and you want to vote law and order, what you should be doing is favoring programs like Head Start, programs like preventive policing, and not throw the book at them, 3 strikes and you're out, you're in prison for the rest of your life because you were caught carrying a knife, for example.
Right.
Yeah, prevention is one of those things where often the main things that people think about are, oh yes, you've got fewer victims. That's obviously very important, and the cost savings from just having fewer victims, like the average residential burglary in Los Angeles ends up costing victims somewhere between $6,000 and $7,000 overall. But in addition to the cost associated with victims, in preventing crime, you also save a lot of cost for the police, because if you have to actually engage in all of the policing work associated with processing that burglary, if you happen to catch somebody, right, there are hours and hours spent off the street, oftentimes for an offender that gets locked up for 48 hours and then they're back on the street, now where there's very limited opportunity for incarceration. But the one thing that's often forgotten about prevention, right, is that in preventing a crime, you're also reducing by 1 or however many times the chance that that individual runs afoul of the legal system, right? And that has benefits, right? That has benefits to the individual, even though they, as an individual, might not voice it in that way. They might have a particular attitude towards crime and criminal enterprise. But at the end of the day, it has benefits to them for preventing that crime in the first place.
Oh, yeah. It definitely does, and we see it. We are beginning to see it over time. And the other thing is, we spend an idiotic amount of money on incarceration. Idiotic. $50,000 for adults. For juveniles under 18 years old, the price goes up. It's anywhere from $150,000 to $200,000 per year because of all the different systems, children's services, probation, that all become involved in this. So if you're a conservative, it's absolutely idiotic to talk about incarceration, whether for juveniles or for adults.
So let me ask one final question, and then maybe we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. So it'll leave us about 15, 20 minutes to talk through some of these things. So I have an insane amount of money right now, and I'm gonna.
It's not his.
It's not mine. I'm going to say, hypothetically, I have an insane amount of money.
Yeah, add that word in there, Jeff.
Hypothetically, I have an insane amount of money, and I'm going to come to both of you and say, what should we do about crime? You've got 10 years, okay, and you really want to do something about crime, violence, aggression in your communities. What would be the things that you would start with, and how would you go about, dealing with that problem?
I'll start, you can add, and then I'll add in. The 2 things that come to mind immediately are we absolutely positively have to rebuild and re-engineer education. Absolutely. And I think we've got to look at alternatives to sentencing. No more locking up prisoner individuals in what is basically graduate school for crime, which is what the prison system is. So I think education, prevention, alternatives to sentencing.
So do you see ethnography playing a role in that? I mean, do you see yourself as delivering some of that in the part of your work, or?
Absolutely, positively, yes. Along with studying the trajectories of gang members, we're looking, my team and I are looking longitudinally at individuals, male and female, who leave gang life. And from those life histories, we've got to report what works and, just as importantly, what does not work, what sends them right back in. I also think we've got to look at parity and income equality.
Right, so just follow up, I find this fascinating. So You yourself have a social work practice, is that right?
No.
Oh, you do not?
Oh, no. They're kind of my practice.
Oh, they are your practice?
But no.
But so I guess the question is do you see a dividing line between sort of the ethnographer as the observer and ethnographer as applying things and making a change?
Oh, yes. I see ethnographers both as, what Behar would say, vulnerable observers, because we are, but I also think we are action agents, and that we can take what we learn in the field and use it to inform policy, which far too often is disconnected from ethnographic reality. And that is the single most important thing I can tell you today. The ethnographer is able to connect reality to policy.
Sure, and so I'll just say at the other end of the spectrum, using data and building mathematical models to deal with that data, and then putting it in the hands of police and actually having impact on policing on the street is very similar. It's not the ethnographic end of the continuum, but it's also actually putting it to effect in the field, and that's an incredibly rewarding experience.
So this again showing you the multiple facets of the ways that anthropology can contribute to addressing important social problems. We can draw directly on evolutionary biology to understand why poverty and criminality are self-perpetuating intergenerationally. So Jorja mentioned the self-conscious efforts that some of these individuals are making to try and break that cycle. If we look to evolutionary biology, we can see a very clear explanation that isn't just about information transmission from one generation to another, although that's important. So imagine two kinds of worlds. One is a very safe world. Death is relatively rare. There are plenty of resources, and competition between individuals doesn't take the form of physical violence. Okay? And the other world is the opposite. Resources are scarce. They're uncertain. You're never sure whether there's going to be food on the table, and you witness violence on a daily basis. Okay? Now, animals live in those different kinds of worlds. There are some communities that are relatively safe and some communities that are relatively dangerous. And natural selection has endowed all of those social animals, ourselves included, with a calculating mechanism that assesses what the best life course is going to be in terms of the probability of leaving descendants. Okay? So individuals, whether they are canines or humans, who grow up in a world of resource scarcity, high rates of mortality, and an uncertain environment, they physically mature earlier, they reproduce earlier in life, they have a shorter lifespan because they're devoting more of their somatic resources to reproduction rather than to maintaining their bodies. And exactly the same things happen in human beings. Whether or not a girl grows up with a father in the home affects the age at which she reaches menarche, that is, when she reaches puberty. And the reason is because there are mechanisms in our minds that are assessing what is the optimal strategy in this environment. So from a policy perspective, I mentioned earlier that the fiscal conservatives should favor addressing programs like Head Start rather than throwing money at incarceration. And that's going to have ramifications across a wide variety of aspects of social problems. So if we think teen pregnancy is a problem, that's going to make a difference. People who have access to school lunches, people who have access to aid to families with dependent children, when community violence is suppressed through effective policing, those people are going to mature later in life. They're going to stay in school longer. They're not going to have children as early. They're going to be less promiscuous in their sexuality. And they have a lower risk of risk-taking in general, including risks with their health other than violence, and involvement in violence and subsequent incarceration. Okay? So it's very clear what the advice that the evolutionary perspective gives the policymaker here is, which is that society should be investing in making life safer, more predictable, and more adequate. And that's exactly why income inequality is such a good predictor of violent crime, because when those situations do not apply, as they don't, sadly, in our own society, the mechanism tracks people into what we call a fast life history trajectory, which is live fast, die young. And people can verbalize that. They'll tell you, why should I save for tomorrow? Why should I save and stay in school when drive-bys happen in my neighborhood?
So thank you very much. Let's take some questions from the audience here. First up here at the front, I'll sort of help moderate this.
Why one of the first facts you mentioned was that the crime rate is down historically, and yet when we listen to the news, we all hear that income disparity is growing, and then some people would say, well, the crime rate has been going down with 3 strikes. I understand from what you're saying you don't feel that's so. So my question would be, to what do you attribute the crime rate going down in the face of the growing income disparity, and what can we do to multiply the effect of that, and what about letting some of the people out of prison? How will that affect that?
Sure, that's a great question. So I have a couple of ideas here. So on the one hand, crime has been going down, particularly among those crimes that the FBI calls Part 1 crimes. So the serious crimes of homicide, rape, robbery, burglary, car theft, those sorts of things. The crime rate online has gone up, right? So to some extent, some offenders have replaced their offending from breaking into a house with stealing credit card information. And frankly, we have not transitioned to a full appreciation of so-called white-collar crime to the degree that we should, and we will be forced to. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But there are complicated public-private boundaries in there. So if you're a corporation X and you just lost $1 billion in credit card fraud, it's really hard to make that information public because it can really have an impact on you. So there are a lot of challenges there. I would argue, though, controversially, that from the point of view of teenagers and teenager crime, the single most important thing that has driven crime rates down is the Sony PlayStation.
I love it. I love it.
Your kids are sitting in their living room playing video games now. When I was a teenager, Friday night I was out in the park or somewhere else seeing stuff I shouldn't have been seeing, probably doing something I shouldn't have been doing, and all those sorts of things. And that's the way it was back in the bad old 70s and 80s, right? Nowadays, kids coordinate better. I'll meet you exactly at this place at this time, right? And then they don't have all this other time to wander around looking for opportunities to get into trouble. And if they are outside, which I know with my 10-year-old, it's really hard to get him outside, right? If they aren't outside, then they're inside playing a video game. And no amount of playing Modern Warfare is going to really replace sort of the crime that they would have been committing out there on the street. So I happen to be of the view that video games are great for crime, not the other way around.
I love it.
I think that's one view. There are other things going on as well.
So there's a substantial debate in criminology as to what has led to the drop in crime. But I think that a case can be made that policing practices are in part responsible for this. So Jeff mentioned earlier pre-deployment of resources, community-based policing. As you know, here in Los Angeles, we've had a radical shift in part following civil unrest in the way that the LAPD tries to connect to communities. So one of the reasons that pre-deployment that Jeff described is so effective is because the potential offender is making calculations about probability of getting caught, right? And if you see police officers in your community at about the time that you were thinking about offending, right, then that really does deter crime. And I think police deployment has become much more effective in general, even in advance of the great strides that Jeff and his colleagues have made, in part through what is commonly referred to as broken windows policing that was adopted here in Los Angeles, which is an effort to stop petty crime, which is used as an index by offenders of the extent to which the police are paying attention. So, if you're getting extorted by the panhandler when you're stopped at a stoplight, if there are broken windows in your neighborhood, if there's a lot of trash on the street, these things encourage subsequent offending. And actually, some of my colleagues have done those experiments where we manipulate the environment and we see how it affects people's propensity, even the average citizen's propensity to steal. It turns out it's pretty easy to get the average person to steal. We can do it in about 3 minutes. We can increase the probability that you will lie for money in about 3 minutes. And what you're responding to are cues as to the level of offending in your immediate environment. This kind of preventive policing really can pay huge dividends.
I would also say we have record numbers of people locked up. And it really we can draw a straight line, including 3 strikes. We can draw a straight line to the explosion in the prison and jail population and the fact that these criminals are not on the street and crime goes down.
Sure. I'll say, and then I think there was a question up here that we'll get. There's no such thing as a zero crime world. There will always be crime. It's really a question, especially when crime rates are so low in Los Angeles right now overall. What level of crime are we willing to accept as a society? Right? There's no such thing as zero crime. It's really a question of how low do we want to have it for how much resource. It's very similar to the question about unemployment, right? You can't drive unemployment to zero. You can get it closer and closer, but the more, the closer you get to 4% or 3% or whatever it happens to be, the more resources you have to pour into it to get it just fractionally lower. And the same thing goes with crime. So, yes, sir.
Yes. Looking at the crime picture globally, yes, there seems to be a trend towards more sophistication and more organized. Specifically, I'm thinking of cybercrimes. I'm thinking of drug smuggling. I'm thinking of human trafficking. And I'm thinking of even the arts and the jewelry thieves with the military precision. So, could you comment on this kind of trend and what's the ways to combat?
I think there's been a real there's been a bifurcation in what goes on in crime. There's, the professionalization of crime in many ways, and very, very organized types of crime. Oftentimes in the context of where violence is used internal to those organizations for policing purposes, right? But they don't want to be externally violent because it draws the attention of the police, right? But it very, very professional, right? And then on the other side, there's the de-skilling of crime. You have the other offenders who are not engaged in those highly skilled crimes. And actually, a good example of the pressures that are placed on those populations over the past 15, 20 years as cars have gotten harder to steal, offenders have switched to stealing stuff from cars, right? So now they can't steal the car, they just break the window and grab the laptop. And so when you hear the LAPD say, hide it, lock it, keep it, they really mean it, right? Because offenders will find that stuff on your car seat and take it. They will do that. So.
Just a footnote. I mean, one of the remarkable things about living in the 21st century, and if you think back to when many of you, say, got your bachelor's degrees, how different the world was, is that what modern technology, and importantly central in that being the internet, allows for is a coordination of actors. Okay, so you really like Paul Klee paintings, and you read Rousseau. Ask the Google, and you can find 100 other people who have exactly your preferences. Okay, those people don't have to be geographically proximate, and instantly you can start to form a community. So what these highly professional organizations do is they're using the same technology that you and I use on a daily basis, cell phones, the internet, and so on, to coordinate their actions in a professional way that was possible in the past, but much more difficult and much more susceptible to invasion by defectors who would then reveal the organization. That's the cost that we pay for living in a world where these coordination technologies are ubiquitous.
So the gentleman in the yellow shirt here.
A question for Jeff and a question for Jorja. Jeff, you mentioned that you were involved in big numbers and big data. The Daily Bruin had an article last week about LAPD and other agencies' use of license plate recognition. Is that a program that you're involved in a consulting basis, or if you could tell us what your understanding of that is, because every one of us is having our license plate snapped as far as where we were at a particular time and a particular location.
Yeah,
and then the question for Jorja, if I could, is in your experience with gangs, did you find that it was more difficult to be accepted into the community of a criminal gang, or did you find it more difficult to be accepted into your husband's community of law enforcement? Because because law enforcement is a closed society, and if you attempted as a spouse to be accepted into his community, what successes did you have? And I think of Sherman Block, our former sheriff, telling me that, Don, you are, I have the biggest gang in the county.
Yeah. So let me just say, I'm not involved in the license plate recognition technology, although this is something that's being used around the globe. But it raises an important issue about transparency, and I think many law enforcement agencies increasingly are aware of the importance of being transparent about what they're doing, how they're using their data, why it's of value in these ways. And it's really, again, getting back to this private-public partnership between the public and law enforcement. The mayor right now is talking about the democratization of data, and I think that's a very important part of this. We are collecting droves and droves of data. We as a society are collecting droves and droves of data about people, where they are, what they like, what movies they watch, these sorts of things. Democratization of data is going to be a critical issue of the coming decades. That's a way of saying, I understand exactly what you're saying about license recognition, and the best way to approach it is transparent, argue for why it's of value, and put in appropriate controls to deal with that data in an appropriate manner.
According to the Daily Bruin article, it said that the LAPD was being very secretive and would not disclose aspects.
Well, obviously I'm not a part of the LAPD. I can't comment on that sort of thing, but I do believe Charlie Beck was interviewed on Larry Mannel's show a few weeks ago, and he was talking explicitly about license plate recognition. So have a listen to that, and this is all, it's something that's being constantly debated, and the debate is important, absolutely important. But obviously I can't speak for the LAPD on those matters.
Okay, so I'm gonna throw this back to the audience. Put your hands up. How many think I had more trouble with gangs? How many think I had more trouble with the LAPD? You're all great ethnographers. I absolutely, to this day, have a much worse time with the LAPD. And Sherman Block echoed or has said what many gang members have said to me, which is they're a big gang. And the difference is they get to legally carry their guns, and we don't. Not the LAPD. If you follow, sadly, what has happened with the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, there's a lot to suggest that there's a lot of gang members say, but I would say hands down. Now, don't let me sugarcoat it. There is suspicion in both groups. But I will be very honest with you. Law enforcement has a somewhat closed, suspicious mentality. I'll be very blunt with you. I think an issue of gender was at play as well. To be blunt, I think that there would be more acceptance of my two colleagues as males than myself as a female as well. Except for my husband, who does accept me.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll take a break. So, yes, sir, right here. Here's a microphone so people can hear you here. Oh, okay.
I wonder if the overall reduction in crime, has been accompanied by a similar reduction in recidivism. Or another way of asking whether or not we are having any success in preventing first-time criminals from becoming career criminals.
So I don't do research on recidivism, but all the numbers seem to suggest that recidivism is still incredibly high and very difficult to move the dial on that. I think the Bureau of Justice Statistics just released a report on recidivism in the state of Florida. It's still running at 75% at 5 years. So 5 years from release from prison, 75% of those people are back in prison.
That is, by the way, NIJ is showing the exact same thing nationally, sort of in a very, very rough way.
And this speaks to a point that Jorja made earlier, which is that incarceration is graduate school for criminals, right? That is, it's an excellent cultural transmission opportunity in order to acquire valuable information to practice one's trade. And this obviously is not sustainable, right? If you have high recidivism rates and in fact you have an escalation in the sophistication of crime as a result of incarceration, then you simply have to snowball if you're going to use incarceration to try and reduce crime, right? That is, you have to keep people in prison for longer. You have to keep increasing the expenses society pays for incarceration. It's not sustainable. We need another alternative.
So thank you very much for your time.